Micah Trenton stood in front of 300 students, his hand trembling with chalk dust. The white professor had just mocked him, publicly, daring him to solve an impossible problem. Not because he thought Micah could, but because he believed he wouldn't. What happened next? Micah didn't just solve it. He created a new method no one had ever seen, and the professor's smirk vanished. But before Micah could sit down, he was told to leave the room. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The morning air inside Houston Gateway University's main lecture hall buzzed with chatter, backpacks unzipping, and the rustling of notebooks. Seats were packed shoulder to shoulder, and students leaned forward with a mix of curiosity and dread. Everyone knew Professor Grant Delroy didn't just teach calculus I. He weaponized it. His class wasn't about learning, it was about surviving. Delroy, a tall, angular man in his mid-50s with icy blue eyes and a reputation as a mathematical purist, paced the front of the amphitheater. He adjusted his tie the way he always did before a calculated takedown, and tapped the chalkboard twice for silence. The sound echoed through the auditorium like a judge's gavel. Students froze. Today wasn't just any lecture, it was the dreaded open challenge day. Once a month, Delroy presented a question so convoluted that even graduate students had reportedly failed to crack it. And today the problem wasn't just complex, it was laced with deception. This one, Delroy began, scribbling an enormous integral expression across the board, is for those of you who claim genius before mastery. He emphasized the word claim as he scanned the room. Micah Trenton sat quietly in the third row, half-shadowed by the upper mezzanine lighting. 18 years old, hoodie zipped up to his chin, earbuds dangling around his neck, and a notebook filled with symbols he barely let anyone see. Born and raised in Southeast Houston, Micah had always been the quiet genius, too smart for the kids in his block, too invisible for teachers to notice. He wasn't supposed to be here. According to every academic counselor he'd ever met, this Tier 1 university wasn't a realistic path. And yet here he was. Delroy's eyes scanned the room until they landed, unmistakably on Micah. Perhaps our silent observer from the third row would care to attempt this one. A ripple of laughter moved through the auditorium. Micah looked up slowly. He hadn't raised his hand. He hadn't even looked at Delroy. But he could feel 300 pairs of eyes on him now. I didn't raise. Oh, come now, Delroy interrupted. Confidence should breed competence, no. Unless you're just another talker. The room quieted. The unspoken tension, racial, academic, institutional, hung in the air like smog. Delroy had done this before, but never so directly, never so public. Micah stood. The movement surprised even him. His legs carried him down the narrow steps like they weren't his own. Every eye followed him, a trail of breathless disbelief. He reached the board, took the chalk Delroy held out like a dare, and stared at the tangled expression scrawled in front of him. It was a trap, a convergence problem with misleading bounds, deliberate dead ends, and layered substitutions that would confuse anyone on first sight. But Micah didn't touch the expression. He stepped to the side and began sketching his own framework on the lower half of the board. Interesting choice, Delroy said, arms crossed. Avoidance through abstraction? But Micah didn't answer. His brain moved like clockwork, gears aligning. Instead of dissecting the given problem, he rewrote the underlying assumptions. Students leaned forward, trying to follow. Lines curved. New axes were drawn. Integrals collapsed. And somewhere between the fifth and sixth line of chalk, the problem mutated into something entirely new, solvable, elegant. Is he reversing the domain entirely? One student whispered.
No way, said another. That's not even in Stewart's textbook.
Delroy's smirk faded. Micah kept writing, hand steady, breath slow. Each line of chalk wasn't just a solution, it was an evolution. He introduced a non-standard variable substitution, created a symmetry around a point that had been ignored, and bypassed the core misdirection of the original equation entirely. Within 7 minutes, the board was a masterpiece. He stepped back, silent. Delroy approached, slowly, eyes narrowing. He scanned the chalkboard, lips twitching with disbelief. This is not standard form, he said. It's not in the curriculum, Micah said quietly. Delroy looked at him, startled. It's not supposed to be, Micah continued, louder now. Because your question wasn't designed to be solved, it was designed to humiliate. A low mim echoed from somewhere in the crowd. Heads turned, Phones came out. Students began recording. Delroy stepped back, shaking his head. Unorthodox solutions are often signs of misunderstanding, not insight. Micah didn't respond. He walked back up the steps, ignoring the growing murmur, the sideways glances of disbelief. His heart was pounding in his ears, but his face stayed unreadable. Delroy, flustered, erased the board without comment, and launched into the next topic. Voice tight, movements sharp. But students weren't listening. They were rewatching their recordings, zooming in, slowing it down. Halfway through the lecture, a student named Rena Wexler posted a tweet. "Yo, black freshman just reversed Delroy's question and invented a method I've never seen. This is wild." It had 3,000 retweets before class even ended. Micah returned to his seat, eyes on the floor, unaware of the storm brewing outside the lecture hall. But the shift had already begun. What was meant to be a humiliation became a spark. The class gasps. Micah isn't just solving the problem, he's rewriting it. As the final lines of chalk dust settled, Micah's hands dropped to his sides. The board behind him, now transformed into something unrecognizable, something brilliant. The silence in the hall wasn't relief, it was stunned disbelief. But instead of acknowledgement, praise, or even a nod of recognition, Professor Delroy tilted his head, narrowed his eyes, and smiled the way someone smiles before delivering a dismissal disguised as critique. Delroy stepped forward, glancing at the equations, not like a man absorbing genius, but like a predator hunting for a crack. The class waited, breathless, expecting him to concede or at least comment on the ingenuity that had just unfolded. But instead his voice cut through the room, measured, cold and mocking. He labeled Micah's work creative nonsense, and the tone of his words felt heavier than chalk. It wasn't just an academic critique, it was a racial insult cloaked in professionalism, meant to remind everyone who truly belonged at the front of the room, and who did. The silence fractured. A few students laughed nervously, unsure whether to align with the professor's authority or the brilliance they had just witnessed. Others stayed silent, their eyes flicking from the chalkboard to Micah and back again, questioning what they thought they understood about intelligence, authority, and race. A handful looked ashamed but didn't speak. Delroy then instructed Micah to leave the lecture hall. The command wasn't yelled. It didn't need to be. The way he said it, quiet and surgical, cut deeper. It wasn't a request for order, it was an exile. Micah didn't protest. He nodded once, eyes low, and began walking back up the aisle. His steps were slow, like every row of students was another staircase he had to climb through mud. The humiliation was thick in the air, dense, deliberate, and public. His body moved forward, but his thoughts spiraled. Was he wrong? Was it really nonsense? Or was this just another place where brilliance didn't count, if it came wrapped in brown skin and a quiet voice? He knew what he had done wasn't just correct, it was inspired. But in that moment, the room made him feel smaller than he had felt in years. The chalk dust clinging to his fingers began to sting. Outside the hall, the cool air of the corridor offered no comfort. It was sterile, humming with the buzz of fluorescent lights and distant voices. Micah leaned against the wall, heart pounding, his mind replaying the last 10 minutes over and over. He felt exposed, not just in his intellect, but in his identity. The problem he solved had never been about calculus. It was about power, and power had just crushed him in front of everyone. But unknown to him, power had also slipped. Inside the hall, a student named Jamal Bennett had kept recording on his phone long after the board was filled. When Delroy barked his command, Jamal didn't stop filming. He captured the entire dismissal, the silence of the room, the visible shift in Delroy's expression, from arrogant to unsettled. But most importantly, Jamal had filmed Micah's method in its entirety, each symbol, curve, and equation preserved before the board was wiped clean by Delroy in a flurry of chalky resentment. Jamal didn't say a word to anyone. He simply packed up, walked outside, and sat on a bench under the gray November sky. There he watched the footage 3 times. It wasn't just good, it was historic. Then he made a decision he knew couldn't be undone. He cropped the video carefully, cutting it just after Delroy's command to leave, and saved it with a caption that pulsed in his mind like a heartbeat. Meanwhile, Micah sat on the steps near the east entrance, staring into nothing. The breeze nudged the hood of his sweatshirt up slightly, and he pulled it over his head, not to hide, but to hold in the confusion crashing inside his skull. He felt the familiar ache of every room he had ever been pushed out of, every classroom where a teacher assumed he was just fast talking, or copying answers. He felt the cold, sharp echo of every time someone called him articulate like it was a surprise. And now, at this elite university, in the most prestigious math department in the region, he had just shown something extraordinary and been dismissed like a child pretending with crayons. It wasn't just racism. It was erasure. Back inside, the energy in the lecture hall didn't return to normal. Delroy continued his lesson, but his words stumbled slightly. Students stared at the board that was now blank, the canvas of rebellion erased. A few of them whispered. One whispered to the other that the problem had been impossible before Micah rewrote it. Another wondered aloud if Delroy even understood what Micah had done. And still, no one spoke up. But outside the university, a shift was already forming. By late afternoon, Jamal's clip was trimmed, watermarked, and quietly shared to a group chat among Black STEM students. The caption was short, direct, and sharp. Professor tried to humiliate a Black student. Didn't end well. The video ran exactly 92 seconds. Someone in the group chat forwarded it to a local student-run Twitter page. The admin of that page, a journalism major named Eva Reese, debated for a few minutes whether to post it, then uploaded it with the same caption. Within 1 hour it had 600 likes. By dinner time it hit 7,000 shares. What none of them realized was that a PhD candidate from MIT, who followed the student account out of nostalgia for undergrad life, happened to see it. He wasn't just a math enthusiast, he was working on a paper regarding advanced optimization systems in integral calculus. The structure Micah used in that lecture hall triggered something he hadn't seen in published literature. It wasn't just original, it had potential applications in systems engineering. And he wasn't the only one who noticed. By the time Micah made it back to his dorm room, the weight of the day had calcified in his chest. His roommate wasn't there. The silence was a relief. He dropped his backpack, collapsed on the bed without taking off his shoes, and stared at the ceiling. He didn't cry, not because it didn't hurt, but because the wound wasn't fresh. It was familiar. His phone buzzed, but he ignored it. It buzzed again, then again. Dozens of notifications began to pop up. Texts, tags, links. One from his childhood friend in Atlanta. Another from a cousin in Detroit. Then a message from a local podcast asking for an interview. Confused, Micah finally picked up the phone. The first thing he saw was his own face, paused in the middle of drawing a line of chalk on the board. Hoodie slightly off-center, eyes focused. The video had gone viral. His name wasn't mentioned yet, but the footage was unmistakable. There he was. The moment that was meant to break him was now being shared across the country. That same evening, a student uploads the clip with the caption, "Professor tried to humiliate a Black student. Didn't end well." The video clip, just over 90 seconds long, started like a dozen other shaky student recordings. Unsteady framing, rustling backpacks, the clatter of chalk. But halfway through, something shifted. The audience, originally focused on Professor Delroy's familiar posturing, began to recognize what they were seeing. Not a student guessing through a math problem, but one reinventing it in real time. And then came the insult. The tone, the command, the silencing dismissal. Every second of it exposed, not just a failure of pedagogy, but a moment of racialized power. Without ever mentioning race directly, Delroy's clipped phrase, his smug posture, and the institutional silence that followed said more than a paragraph ever could. That's what made it viral. Within 6 hours, the clip had jumped from a local Twitter thread to the For You pages of TikTokers in California, New York, and even Canada. Creators with hundreds of thousands of followers slowed the clip frame by frame, pointing to Micah's hand movements, highlighting the unfamiliar notations, and pausing over the moment Delroy called his work nonsense. They zoomed into his eyes, his posture, and the look he gave before walking away. Some labeled it resilience, others called it genius. But all agreed, it was injustice. By hour 10, the hashtags had begun trending. Chalkboard revolution, Black Math Matters, and Micah Meth. Creators from across the internet began weighing in. Math educators posted breakdowns, pausing over specific substitutions and integrals they claimed they'd never seen. A high school calculus teacher from Oakland posted a video whispering in awe, "I don't know who this kid is, but this is something new." Meanwhile, racial justice influencers latched onto the broader context. One more example of a Black mind being dismissed inside a white institution. Their captions said it plainly: a Black student solved what the professor couldn't, and they erased his name with the board. What had begun as a quiet insult now roared through digital corridors. But virality is a fire with no conscience. As praise exploded, so did attacks. An anonymous Reddit thread popped up accusing Micah of plagiarism. A fringe YouTube personality uploaded a reaction video titled, "Another Fake Genius Hoax," and ranted about race-based favoritism in academia. Within the hour, trolls began digging for Micah's old posts, his high school records, any hint they could weaponize. One found a childhood photo from a community STEM camp and mocked his posture. Another accused him of being a welfare genius, hinting that his rise must have been funded by diversity quotas. Micah, however, saw none of it. The notifications were there, hundreds of unread texts, messages, tags, but he hadn't picked up his phone once since that walk of shame out of Delroy's lecture. He barely slept. He didn't eat dinner. He stared at the ceiling, headphones in but no music playing, replaying the humiliation in his head like a punishment loop. Every second felt like a rehearsal for his own inadequacy, even as the world outside erupted in his name. By the time the sun rose, the PR team at Houston Gateway University was in full crisis mode. The communications director, shaken from sleep by a midnight call, watched the clip 3 times before realizing this wasn't a student protest. It was a cultural moment. Damage control meetings began before breakfast. Every email carried urgency. Talking points were drafted. The strategy was twofold: protect the university's image and contain the narrative before legacy media picked it up. Their first instinct was to paint Micah as a valued member of the student body, but caution him privately against encouraging public discourse that undermined academic order. They hoped he would issue a statement, expressing regret for the misunderstanding. But no one had spoken to him yet. No one even knew where he stood, not just physically but emotionally. And then came the twist they hadn't expected. At exactly 8:11 a.m., a verified account belonging to a professor from MIT posted a still frame of Micah's chalkboard method, with the caption, "This structure isn't in any current calculus textbook. This young man may have just contributed to mathematics." The post went viral within minutes. Suddenly, the story wasn't just about injustice. It was about innovation. Other scholars jumped in. A data scientist from Stanford commented that the method resembled early-stage numerical modeling systems used in AI logic gates. A math editor from an academic journal requested contact information. The story was no longer a scandal. It was becoming a discovery. Yet the subject of all this attention was still in his dorm room. Unaware, Micah sat curled in his desk chair, knees pulled up, a book open in front of him that he hadn't turned the page on in hours. He had finally picked up his phone but hesitated to unlock it. A part of him feared what he might see: mockery, rejection, or worse, silence. The video still felt like a wound he didn't want to look at. He didn't know his name had become a movement. He didn't know he had changed the conversation. When he finally unlocked his phone, it buzzed non-stop. The screen lit up with pings from apps he didn't even use, names he didn't recognize, DMs from blue-check influencers, comments from strangers calling him a role model. His thumb scrolled, paralyzed. A friend from his childhood church had tagged him in a video breakdown. His high school math teacher had posted a teary-eyed Facebook message. But Micah couldn't process any of it. He turned the phone over and placed it face down. To Micah, none of this erased what happened in that room. No tweet could unhear Delroy's voice. No hashtag could wash away the sting of being called nonsense. The damage wasn't just external, it was ancestral. It was centuries of brilliance dismissed, rewritten, stolen, or erased. It was the feeling that even when you create something new, it only matters once someone else confirms it's real. The praise felt dangerous, like a spotlight that might catch fire. At the same time, the internet was doing what institutions refused to do: recognize. A graphic designer posted a digital rendering of Micah standing at the board, cloak of chalk dust swirling behind him like smoke. It was shared over 100,000 times. A journalist from a major magazine requested an interview. A popular podcast for Black academic excellence named him their Person of the Week. The media storm intensified, and yet Micah remained quiet. This silence worried the university. Because silence in a moment like this wasn't protection, it was power. If Micah spoke out, the entire institution could be exposed. And the longer he stayed quiet, the more people wondered what else was being hidden. What had led to this? Was this part of a pattern? Had Delroy done this before? Alumni began asking questions. Donors sent cautious inquiries. Students whispered stories about other moments. Grades that felt unfair. Questions ignored. Black students who dropped the class after being made to feel small. The story that began with one student was growing teeth. And yet Micah still hadn't responded. The PR office decided to send a representative, someone who could check in and quietly steer the conversation. Someone who could make this story go away, or at least keep it manageable. But even as they debated what to say, another post hit Twitter, a blurry photo of Delroy from years ago, standing next to a conference poster about preserving classical logic in a changing demographic. The caption read, "Y'all really didn't see this coming." That's when the university understood. This wasn't going away. As the sun climbed higher over the campus, students passed one another, heads tilted down toward their phones, watching the clip, reading the breakdowns, whispering about Micah. His name echoed in classrooms, cafeterias, even parking lots. But inside his dorm room, he remained still, caught between the echo of humiliation and the roar of a revolution he didn't ask to start. Then a knock at the door. Not the casual knock of a friend. Not the rhythmic tap of someone delivering food. This knock was sharp. Official. Micah turned uncertain. A knock on Micah's door. It's the dean. The knock that came to Micah's door wasn't urgent, but it wasn't gentle either. It had the cold rhythm of institutional protocol, measured, rehearsed, and insistent. When he opened the door, he saw Dean Melissa Corbin, standing there in a navy suit, her posture immaculate, her expression studied. She held a manila folder, and a thin smile, the kind that had been trained in 1,000 boardroom meetings and press briefings. She didn't ask to come in. She didn't need to. Micah stepped aside, and she entered the room like a representative of something far larger than herself. She wasn't here as a person. She was here as the voice of the university. Dean Corbin didn't waste time. She began with measured concern, her voice threaded with carefully chosen words. Words like community, reputation, and impact. She referenced the video as the recent situation. She acknowledged Professor Delroy's tone as unfortunate, and Micah's solution as impressive. But her flattery came laced with restraint. Not too much praise, not too little condemnation, just enough to sound diplomatic. Then she opened a folder. Inside was a 3-page non-disclosure agreement. Alongside it, a revised scholarship letter that included a modest increase in financial aid and the promise of a summer research placement, provided Micah would agree to 2 conditions. 1, that he not speak publicly about the incident, and 2, that he issue a short prepared statement framing his solution as an innovative exploration, not a groundbreaking method. The phrasing hit him like a slap through silk. It wasn't just strategic, it was surgical. By calling his method an exploration, they could discredit the mathematical value, while still appearing supportive. It was an erasure dressed as inclusion. The university didn't want a prodigy. It wanted silence. Micah didn't speak for several minutes. He sat on the edge of his bed, reading the document while Dean Corbin remained standing. She didn't rush him. Her silence was part of the pressure. Let the weight of opportunity hang in the air long enough, and most students would fold. But Micah wasn't most students. When he finally looked up, his eyes weren't confused or angry. They were clear. He handed the folder back. Dean Corbin's smile didn't fade, but it flattened. She nodded slowly, as if she had already anticipated this, though her fingers tensed slightly against the folder. She thanked him for his time, offered a polite reminder that public narratives often distort academic processes, and left the room as calmly as she had entered. But Micah understood something crucial now. He was at war, not with Delroy, not even with the university alone, but with a system designed to tolerate black brilliance only when it was quiet, grateful, and non-threatening. That night, the air on campus shifted again. At 9:42 p.m., screenshots of anonymous emails began circulating on a student forum. The emails were dated as far back as 2017. They were from black students who had taken Professor Delroy's classes and filed complaints through official channels. The content was damning. Students described hostile interactions, unfair grading, verbal microaggressions, and being publicly undermined during lectures. One email read, "Delroy asked me if I was more interested in activism than accuracy after I challenged a grading error." Another student had detailed a pattern of receiving lower scores for showing non-standard methods, despite correct answers. One complaint referenced how Delroy had once referred to a group project led by black students as groupthink over substance. Yet another outlined how Delroy docked participation points when the student missed class due to a racial justice protest, despite having an excused absence. The most haunting message came from a former student who claimed she dropped out of the mathematics program entirely after Delroy allegedly told her, "Statistical anomalies don't define systems. Just because you're here doesn't mean the system's broken." The university had received these emails. None had led to action. Now they were public. The campus boiled. Students began organizing. Posters went up overnight, handwritten, photocopied, digital prints, plastered across lecture halls and bulletin boards. One read, "How many more Micahs?" Another, "Delroy didn't start with him." A group of graduate students began collecting additional testimony, creating a public archive called the Erased Voices Project. The administration responded with a carefully worded press release. It stated the university's commitment to diversity and academic integrity, and assured a comprehensive internal review. But the language was empty, devoid of urgency. The words racism, bias, and abuse never appeared once. Micah watched all of this unfold from his dorm room, still refusing interviews, still unreadable. His inbox overflowed with media requests, alumni emails, and outpourings of support. But the support felt just as loud as the scrutiny. Some people lifted him up only to use his story for their own narratives. Some black students messaged him to say thank you. Others warned him, "Don't let them package you. Don't let them turn you into a symbol." He didn't respond to anyone. Not yet. Instead, he opened his notebook. The same one he'd carried into Delroy's lecture that day. The one full of ideas he'd never shown anyone. He flipped through it now, page by page, equation by equation, as if reading the journal of someone else. Someone braver, someone whose work had just sparked a national conversation. But the feeling inside him wasn't victory. It was mourning. He mourned the hours spent shrinking himself to fit into classrooms that were never built for him. He mourned the ways he had convinced himself not to speak up, not to show off, not to draw too much attention. He mourned the genius in other black students that had been crushed before it could grow, and he mourned how familiar it all felt. The world was watching him now, but he still felt like he was fighting alone. Then, at 11:03 p.m., a new email arrived. The subject line was short: "Invitation to discuss your work." The sender, Dr. Kendra Lyle, Director of Research at the Vanguard Institute of Mathematical Discovery, one of the most prestigious independent mathematics institutions in the world. The body of the email was polite but urgent. Lyle wrote that Micah's recent method had sparked significant interest among their senior researchers. They believed he had identified a structure that could lead to new pathways in nonlinear systems optimization. They wanted to meet, privately, as soon as possible. Micah stared at the screen. His heartbeat quickened, not from excitement, but from disbelief. The Vanguard Institute rarely reached out to undergraduates. They didn't recruit, they discovered. The invitation wasn't just an opportunity. It was validation on a global scale. And suddenly, the quiet voice inside him, the one that had always whispered he was an imposter, a fluke, a lucky guess, went silent. Micah receives an email from a world-renowned math institute asking for a meeting. Micah sat at Gate 4 of Houston Intercontinental Airport, a small carry-on bag at his feet, and a heavy silence pressed into his chest. The flight to New York was only 3 hours, but the emotional distance between his present and what waited at the other end felt immeasurable. He'd never been this far north, never boarded a plane for anything other than funerals or the rare debate trip. But this wasn't a trip. It was a summon. The Broxley Institute for Advanced Mathematics wasn't just prestigious. It was legendary. Founded in the early 20th century, its alumni included Fields Medal winners, Nobel affiliates, and the very architects of modern mathematical theory. It was a place where ideas were studied like symphonies, where formulas weren't just solved. They were composed. The kind of place people like Micah were never expected to step into, let alone be invited to. But the invitation had come. Personal, intentional, and filled with reverent curiosity about the method he'd scribbled in chalk that day, in Houston. The institute wasn't just impressed, they were intrigued. His method, they said, closely resembled the groundwork of an unsolved optimization problem in advanced systems engineering, something their labs had been quietly pursuing for years without success. By the time his plane touched down in New York, Micah still hadn't decided what to feel. Pride was tangled with fear, disbelief wrapped in suspicion. Was this real, or just another setup designed to collapse under him? A driver with a name placard waited at the terminal. The ride into the city was quiet, tinted windows blurring the chaos of Manhattan. The Broxley Institute stood like a cathedral to intellect, Gothic arches, glass-paneled research towers, and walls lined with equations etched into metal like scripture. It looked more like a museum than a school. Micah stepped through its main atrium with slow, cautious awe. A group of researchers greeted him, diverse, excited, and already buzzing with anticipation. They didn't shake hands like bureaucrats or speak like recruiters. They talked to him like peers, with real questions, authentic wonder. Inside a reserved conference room, he was asked to walk them through his solution. Not to test him, but to understand. Micah drew it all out again on a smartboard. Hands steady, voice low. The rhythm returned, the same one he'd felt during Delroy's challenge. Only this time, no one interrupted, no one scoffed, and when he finished, no one tried to reduce it. What followed was a kind of intellectual reverence he'd never experienced. Mathematicians whispered comparisons to obscure unsolved problems from Eastern European journals. One professor gasped softly as he pointed to a structural bypass in Micah's logic that mirrored an attempt theorized decades ago, but never proven. Micah wasn't just original. He was potentially historic. The Institute didn't wait to offer their proposal. They wanted to bring him in, fully. Not just as a visiting student, but as a named research fellow. They would provide mentorship, academic freedom, and access to every resource the Institute possessed. His work would be studied, credited, and potentially published under his own name. But there was a cost. To accept, Micah would need to transfer. Immediately. That meant forfeiting his full-ride scholarship to Houston Gateway. It also meant leaving his support system, his neighborhood, his family, and everything familiar. His identity, rooted in struggle and survival, would be uprooted and replanted in the unfamiliar soil of elite academia. That night he walked alone through Central Park. Coat zipped high against the November wind, snow flurries danced across the air, and lights from skyscrapers blinked in the distance. It was quiet, but not peaceful. His thoughts spun. His mother's sacrifices, his community's pride, the unspoken burden of representation. If he left Houston, would they think he sold out? Would they say he abandoned the fight? But staying meant something else entirely. It meant settling. And after everything, he wasn't sure if he could go back and pretend like the board had never been erased, like the insult had never been spoken. Back in his hotel room, Micah sat with the offer email open on his laptop, the cursor blinking under his name. There was no deadline, but he knew this window wouldn't stay open forever. The Institute had made it clear, they weren't just interested in him. They believed in his potential to alter their trajectory. And yet, even with all that validation, the uncertainty gnawed at his gut like acid. He didn't fear failure. He feared betrayal of the people who had rooted for him, of the version of himself who had walked into Delroy's class with nothing but notebooks and nerve. But the real betrayal came the next morning. An email from Houston Gateway's Office of Academic Affairs landed in his inbox at 6. Subject: Notice of Academic Integrity Review. Micah Trenton. The message was sterile, written in cold administrative language. It stated that a formal complaint had been filed against Micah, alleging academic misconduct. The complaint, submitted by Professor Grant Delroy, claimed that Micah's method bore anomalous similarities to external material not cited or acknowledged. It cited the need for a review into whether his solution constituted original work in accordance with the university's standards. Micah sat frozen at the desk, the words blurring in front of him. He read the message again, and again, then once more. Delroy had accused him of academic fraud. Not only had the professor dismissed his work, not only had he erased it from the board, not only had he humiliated him publicly. Now, he had filed a formal attempt to bury it, not through argument or proof, but through bureaucracy. It wasn't just personal. It was institutional sabotage. Micah stared at the screen, the cursor blinking like a countdown. He understood the strategy. If they couldn't disprove the math, they'd discredit the mathematician. A stain on his academic record, even if later cleared, would haunt every journal, every application, every grant. It would cast a shadow long enough to extinguish a rising star before it could even climb. The university hadn't responded to the leaked complaints against Delroy, but they had responded to his method with silence, then with sabotage. For the first time in weeks, Micah felt rage. Not the hot, screaming kind, but the cold, seething awareness that he was in a rigged system. One that welcomed his talent, only when it stayed in its place. One that punished genius, when it came wrapped in a body they didn't expect. He forwarded the email to the Broxley Institute. By noon, Dr. Kendra Lyle responded. Her message was short. She wrote that this was deeply concerning, and that the Institute would assist in securing independent legal and academic review, should Micah choose to proceed. Then she added a sentence that pierced through the fog in his chest. Your work stands on its own, and so do you. Micah sat back, exhaled, and closed the laptop. He knew what he had to do. But war had been declared. Professor Delroy files a complaint accusing Micah of academic fraud. The moment Delroy's complaint hit the university's internal system, the whispers became thunder. In less than 24 hours, the news leaked, not through a press release or official notice, but through the same students who had been following Micah's story from the first moment chalk hit the board. The phrase academic fraud attached to Micah's name struck like a match in dry grass. It wasn't just an accusation, it was a warning. The system wasn't going to applaud a young black genius. It was going to crush him under its protocols. The headlines came fast. Brilliance or plagiarism? Rising star under scrutiny. From chalkboard hero to cheating allegations. Who is Micah Trenton? University to investigate controversial black math prodigy. The same media outlets that once championed Micah now questioned him. News anchors offered faux neutral segments filled with concern-tinted skepticism. Talk shows debated whether his race played a role in his rapid rise. Pundits tossed around phrases like academic tokenism and the DEI effect. A former politician suggested this was the cost of rushing unqualified candidates into complex academic arenas. Micah didn't watch the broadcasts. He couldn't. What he did watch, over and over again, was the email. The line Delroy had written, carefully crafted to sound objective, but laced with poison. The mathematical structure presented appears anomalously similar to unresolved material in theoretical literature. I question the source and originality. It was a bureaucratic dagger, one that didn't accuse directly, but implied criminality just enough to stain. The Broxley Institute responded immediately. Dr. Lyle issued a public statement that shook academic circles. She confirmed that Micah's work had undergone rigorous independent verification by their researchers and was found to be original, mathematically sound, and novel in approach. She added that the Institute was preparing to publish his method under a new classification in their international journal. That declaration shifted the ground again. Suddenly the conversation split in two. One side fueled by racial justice advocates, progressive academics, and a growing chorus of black intellectuals saw this for what it was, an institutional effort to dismantle a black prodigy. The other side, louder and increasingly hostile, painted Micah as the poster child for what they called performative scholarship. They refused to believe a freshman black, low-income first generation could produce something advanced mathematicians hadn't solved. It wasn't just disbelief. It was racialized disbelief. But Micah didn't stand alone. Into the fray stepped Pastor Elijah Doss, a retired school teacher and community leader who had known Micah since childhood. Pastor Doss had taught him algebra on a church blackboard when he was just 8 years old. He had seen the fire in Micah's eyes long before the world had, and when the headlines broke, he didn't hesitate. He traveled to New York unannounced, arriving at Micah's hotel room with a coat that had seen too many winters and a voice that still carried Sunday morning power. When Micah opened the door and saw him, something in his chest cracked, not from weakness, but from remembering the strength he came from. Pastor Doss didn't come to lecture. He came to remind him that his gift was real, that his struggle was ancestral, that this wasn't just about math, it was about the cost of black excellence in white spaces. He told Micah that every breakthrough born from a black mind had first been treated as theft, that genius when black was always a threat before it became a contribution. And he told him not to back down. Micah listened, silent but absorbing every word like water into parched ground. He didn't speak much, but when he looked up, there was fire again behind his eyes. That night, he made a decision. He would fight, not through social media, not with outrage, but with proof. He partnered with a civil rights legal team that specialized in educational discrimination. Together they prepared a full rebuttal to Delroy's complaint, complete with independent verification, time-stamped notebooks, and expert testimony from Broxley researchers. The legal strategy was clear. Expose not just the baselessness of the accusation, but the pattern behind it. Meanwhile, the Broxley Institute accelerated its publication process. They arranged for Micah's method to appear in the upcoming quarterly edition of the Journal of Modern Optimization, alongside a commentary from 3 established mathematicians validating its originality and impact. This wasn't just academic support, it was public record. The university, cornered by optics and mounting pressure, tried to delay the review process. They cited procedural timelines, committee availability, and confidentiality, but the court of public opinion wasn't waiting. Micah's name trended again, but this time alongside Delroy's. Old videos surfaced, recordings of lectures, where Delroy made racially charged comments, subtle jabs and dismissive remarks when black students spoke up. Former students shared stories anonymously at first, then publicly. One admitted she had changed majors because of his condescension. Another said he once used her example during a lecture on non-standard results, and laughed. The university could no longer pretend this was isolated. In response to the growing storm, an independent debate forum proposed a live-streamed academic discussion between Micah and Delroy. Neutral setting, public audience, moderated by a panel of mathematics scholars. The offer was bold, unprecedented, and risky. Delroy accepted immediately. He believed the formality and pressure would expose Micah's limitations. He didn't want justice, he wanted spectacle. In his mind, genius couldn't come from someone like Micah without a cost. If he couldn't erase him through policy, he would do it through performance. Micah hesitated. He wasn't afraid of being wrong. He was afraid of being misinterpreted, of speaking truth, and still being disbelieved. But after long talks with Pastor Das, Dr. Lyle and the legal team, he agreed. Not because he needed validation, but because the system needed confrontation. The announcement of the debate broke the internet. Micah versus Delroy, the academic reckoning. Prodigy faces off with professor in historic debate. Math, race, and power. All eyes on Wednesday night. It was scheduled for 7 p.m. Eastern, streamed live across multiple platforms. Already, watch parties were being organized in college campuses, libraries, and community centers nationwide. Micah's face appeared on flyers, promo graphics, even TikTok dance edits. It was absurd, overwhelming, surreal, and yet somehow inevitable. Micah knew this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about proving that black genius didn't need white permission to exist. That his mind wasn't a miracle. It was a reflection of suppressed potential everywhere. He didn't want to be famous. He wanted to be undeniable. On the night before the debate, he walked past the chalkboard in the Broxley Institute's main hallway, the one every fellow signed when they published their first paper. It was filled with names carved in white across decades of discovery. He ran his fingers over the smooth, cold surface. Tomorrow, the world would watch, and they would have to choose. A live-streamed debate is scheduled. Professor Delroy versus Micah. By the time the virtual countdown reached 0, over 200,000 viewers were already logged in, across platforms, Zoom, YouTube Live, academic forums, even Twitch. It wasn't just students and professors watching anymore. Parents, journalists, activists, and complete strangers tuned in. This was no longer an academic forum. It had become cultural theater. The virtual stage was split down the middle. On the left, Professor Grant Delroy appeared from a sterile faculty conference room, framed by a wall of books and university flags. He wore a sharp navy suit, face taut with control, eyes scanning the interface like he was preparing for war. On the right, Micah Trenton sat in a small study room at the Broxley Institute, plain hoodie zipped up, no bookshelf behind him, just a whiteboard and a quiet resolve in his gaze. The moderator, Dr. Raina Solis, a renowned math ethicist, greeted the audience and laid the ground rules: a fair, timed structure, mutual respect, and academic rigor. Her presence was deliberate. A Latina woman known for dismantling bias in academic review boards, she'd been chosen specifically to keep the playing field honest. Delroy opened first. His tone was commanding, each word coated in experience and elitism. He spoke of his decades of teaching, his publications, his familiarity with mathematical abstraction. He warned of sudden sensationalism, clouding critical evaluation, and subtly invoked the importance of gatekeeping to preserve academic integrity. He never mentioned race. He didn't have to. Every line of condescension carried the weight of an invisible hierarchy. He concluded with a thinly veiled critique that young students often mistake intuition for invention, and without formal guidance, even sincere efforts can become mathematical mirages. Micah's expression didn't change. Then it was his turn. He didn't rush. He didn't retaliate. He began with a simple digital slide, a cleaned-up version of the same chalkboard structure that had started it all. As he explained, line by line, substitution by transformation, Symmetry by intention. The digital whiteboard filled with logic. There was no flair, no theatrics, just clarity. Viewers leaned in. So did panelists. Micah walked them through his method as if he were leading them through a familiar neighborhood, pointing out shortcuts, hidden routes, unexpected intersections. He referenced well-established theorems, but never used them as shields. He didn't overextend his claims. He showed how he reached his conclusions, what questions had led him there, and why it worked. Every rebuttal Delroy attempted was met not with emotion, but with proof. The tension escalated when Delroy interrupted. He questioned the step involving a nested limit transformation, calling it a conceptual leap, inconsistent with undergraduate comprehension. It was a backhanded accusation, a way to imply plagiarism without directly naming it. Micah didn't flinch. He opened another slide, a photograph of his notebook from 3 months earlier. The same transformation. Dated, time-stamped, and initial. He then displayed a reference to a 1997 research paper that had inspired a portion of his logic, but clarified that his approach diverged from that model at the critical pivot point, the very gap researchers had failed to close. Delroy went quiet. For the first time, the professor blinked, leaned back slightly, and paused. Dr. Solis intervened to restore pacing, but the silence was already loud.
Then came the twist.
One of the panelists, Dr. Brian Noland, a systems theorist and visiting fellow at MIT, requested to speak. He thanked both participants, then revealed that Micah's method had been under confidential review by a cross-institutional research coalition for 2 weeks. Without naming specifics, he confirmed that the structure Micah developed aligned with a framework MIT's own researchers had been unsuccessfully exploring. Another panelist from Stanford corroborated. "This is not just a solution," she said. "It's a potential framework for accelerating convergence modeling in variable-dependent algorithms. This could impact how we optimize energy systems, data compression, possibly even AI logic mapping." The room turned. Delroy tried to recover. He cited journal metrics and the slow pace of academic verification. He suggested the panelists were enthusiastic, but perhaps premature in their conclusions. His voice, once steady, now cracked slightly under the strain of diminishing control. Micah didn't respond to the professor. He didn't need to. The forum had already shifted. The audience wasn't watching to be convinced anymore. They were watching history rearrange itself. Dr. Solis thanked both participants and prepared to conclude, but before the stream could end, another voice chimed in. It was the moderator's assistant, relaying a live comment from a verified account watching the debate. The message flashed across the screen. "We'd like to extend Micah Trenton a full-time research position in advanced systems modeling. Please check your inbox." The sender, Aria Vega, CTO of Lumalogic, one of the most innovative tech firms in America, known for poaching academic talent and building AI systems used in energy grids and aerospace technologies. Their offer was no internship. It was employment, lucrative, immediate, and built on belief. The comments section exploded. Students screamed in excitement. Academics stared in stunned silence. Influencers clipped the moment and blasted it across platforms. Within 5 minutes, Micah Trenton was trending again. This time not for being accused but for being recruited. Delroy's camera feed froze momentarily. Whether intentional or technical, no one could tell. But when it returned, the professor had muted himself. Micah didn't smile. He nodded once, silently, then closed his slides. The stream ended. But the world didn't. Micah receives a job offer, live on air, from a tech company. After the debate, Micah Trenton ceased to be a student in the public's eyes. Overnight, he became a symbol, a genius, a prodigy, a battleground. His inbox overflowed with invitations to speak, partner, consult. Lumalogic's public job offer turned into a bidding war, with multiple companies layering in stock options, research budgets, and headline-worthy salaries. News segments hailed him as the math mind of a generation. Business magazines called him the unlikely visionary. But for every polished feature, there was an edge of commodification, language that tried to flatten his story into something marketable. They didn't just want his method. They wanted his voice, his look, his struggle. Tech companies sent emissaries dressed in jeans and jargon. They praised his brilliance and offered glossy visions of innovation, complete with video teams, stylists, and content calendars. Some even brought contracts with clauses that transferred partial intellectual rights of any future research conducted under their banner. Micah, watching their polished slideshows, realized what they truly sought: ownership. They didn't want to elevate him. They wanted to own his story. Micah's internal compass twisted under the weight of attention. With every passing day, the line between opportunity and exploitation blurred. His public image became a currency, bought, reshaped, traded, and behind every smile, every handshake, every promise of freedom, was the subtle threat: if he said no, the offers could vanish as quickly as they appeared. Back in Houston, his old community watched with admiration, but also fear. His mother, Evelyn Trenton, a retired postal clerk who'd raised him alone, saw the headlines with unease. She didn't understand non-linear optimization, but she understood systems, and she had seen too many young black men become mascots before being discarded. She called Micah one night, her voice steady. She didn't scold. She didn't beg. She simply reminded him: visibility was a double-edged blade. The world might clap for him today, but if it ever turned, if he ever made a mistake or refused to play along, the fall would be fast and unforgiving. Micah sat in silence after that call, his thoughts spinning. He remembered the way his neighborhood celebrated his debate. He remembered the barber shop back home pausing the live stream, the way his childhood math teacher cried on Facebook, and now he feared becoming a cautionary tale, a boy who escaped, only to become someone else's brand. Then came the first hit piece. It started on a fringe, academic blog known for its contrarian takes. The article, titled "The African Math Myth," accused Micah of plagiarizing undocumented tribal algorithms and falsely claiming them as his own. The author argued that Micah's method resembled pre-colonial West African number systems, and that his rise was an orchestrated effort by progressive academia to inflate minority genius. The piece was laced with pseudoscience, historical revisionism, and thinly veiled racism, but it spread shared by trolls, amplified by accounts hungry for controversy. Within hours it had over 200. Micah didn't respond, but the damage seeped in. Trolls flooded his social media with images of spears and huts, captioned with "show your sources." Anonymous threads accused him of being a puppet, a diversity hire, a fraud wrapped in political correctness. One post read, "Genius, or just another system-built hoax?" The attacks weren't intellectual. They were cultural, aimed not at what Micah had done, but at who he was. At Broxley, researchers rallied around him. They issued statements. They defended his work. But even they couldn't shield him from the emotional toll. Every click, every comment, every repost was a fresh incision, and Micah began to pull inward. He skipped 2 interviews, declined 5 offers, stopped returning media calls. The momentum that had carried him from chalkboard to stardom slowed, not from failure, but from fatigue. He started to wonder if his rise had always been conditional, if their love for him was a performance, easily revoked.
Then came the final blow.
Late one evening, after returning from a closed-door meeting at the Institute, Micah stepped into the lobby of his temporary apartment building. The air was cold, the hallway too quiet. As he approached his unit, something felt wrong. The door was cracked open. Micah froze. Inside, drawers were pulled out, papers scattered. His laptop was missing, books lay torn. But it wasn't theft, it was a message. Spray painted across the living room wall, in jagged black letters, was a single word: fraud. The smell of paint was fresh. The room buzzed with it. Micah didn't scream. He didn't cry. He stood there breathing slowly, fists clenched, heart pounding. The vandal hadn't just violated his space. They had tried to erase his dignity. Security arrived 10 minutes later. Police followed. Statements were taken, footage reviewed. But the cameras in the hallway had conveniently malfunctioned. No suspects. No timeline. Just silence. Micah's hands shook as he packed the few things left untouched. The only thing undamaged was his original notebook, tucked under a stack of research articles. The same notebook that began it all. He stared at the word on the wall. He didn't feel broken. He felt awakened. Micah's apartment is vandalized with the word fraud. The word on the wall stayed in Micah's mind long after it was scrubbed clean. Fraud, in thick, dripping black paint, wasn't just vandalism. It was a declaration, a sentence, a scar. The apartment complex's management filed a report. The building's front desk offered a vague apology. 2 campus officers showed up, asked a few questions, then dismissed it as probably a dumb college prank. One even smirked when he said it. No fingerprints were taken. No photo, just paperwork filed and forgot. Micah stood there as if he were made of glass. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. But something behind his eyes hardened. A silence deeper than grief. The system wasn't just indifferent now. It was complicit. By morning, the media had already moved on. Headlines buried the break-in under euphemisms. Incident at student housing. No suspects. No harm. Talk shows that had once celebrated him now avoided his name. Major outlets stopped returning calls from Broxley's press team. The silence echoed louder than any slur. But the hate didn't stop. Within days, Micah began receiving letters. Not digital messages. Actual paper letters. Untraceable, unmarked, folded sheets of copy paper, shoved under doors or taped to walls near his lectures. Some were short. One sentence printed in bold caps. "You're not special." Others were longer. Twisted essays masked as feedback that accused him of intellectual theft, arrogance, or worse. One even included a sketch of a rope. Broxley tightened security. They assigned escorts. Installed cameras. But Micah knew protection was an illusion. Threats that arrived by envelope didn't need to cross-lock doors to hurt. They crawled into your mind, burrowed into your gut, and changed how you breathe. Yet Micah didn't disappear. He kept attending lectures. He kept meeting with research mentors. He even returned to the whiteboard, where it had all started, and one afternoon, added a new equation, subtle, coded, elegant, a nod to resilience written in variables. But outside the institute, a different resistance was building. Social media didn't forget. A coalition of student activists, educators, and local organizers announced a public event, the Rally for Reason. What began as an online hashtag became a physical movement. Posters bloomed across Houston. Flyers appeared in cafes, campuses, churches. A massive demonstration was planned outside Houston Gateway University, the place where Micah's erasure had begun. The goal was clear. Solidarity, justice, visibility. 1,000 RSVP. Micah hadn't planned to go, but the night before the rally, Pastor Elijah Das called him again. His voice was warm, gravelly, weathered by time and truth. He reminded Micah that silence had never protected them, that safety had never been freely given. It had always been claimed, and sometimes presence alone was resistant. Micah listened, and in the morning he boarded a flight to Houston. The sun was high when he arrived at the university gates. The air buzzed with chants, drums, and voices layered in unity. Students held signs, "Protect Black Genius. We belong in every room," and from fraud to founder. Micah stood near the center, surrounded by people who had only known him through pixels and headlines, yet saw him clearly. News cameras returned. Live streams began. A drone hovered above, filming the sea of bodies moving as one. Micah didn't speak on stage. He didn't need to. His presence, calm, defiant, undeniable, was its own statement. He moved through the crowd like a current, people stepping aside, whispering his name like a hymn. But beneath the rhythm of protest, something darker stirred. At the edge of the square, a group of masked men appeared. At first they blended in, neutral clothing, unmarked signs, but their eyes told a different story. Cold, calculated, watching. They didn't chant. They didn't clap. They moved like wolves at the edge of firelight. Then the chaos cracked. It began with a flare, bright, sharp, unexpected. Someone threw it into the air. A flash of smoke and sound. Then came the screams, shoves. A bottle shattered. People ran. What had started as peace twisted into panic. Micah was pushed sideways as the crowd rippled in shockwaves. He tried to stay upright, scanning for an exit, but bodies crashed against him. Shoulders collided. Voices rose in confusion. Somewhere behind him, a fight broke out, screams laced with fists and metal poles. And then he saw them. The masked group had surged forward. One of them held a red canister. Another carried a chain. Their signs now visible. "Math isn't woke. Stop the lies." And in large black ink, "He's the real virus." Micah stumbled, nearly falling over a curb. Two protesters grabbed his arms, pulling him away from the surge. One of them, a woman in her 20s wearing a medic patch, led him through an alley behind the administration building. Another stranger, voice trembling, handed him a hoodie to cover his face. They didn't ask who he was. They already knew. Sirens howled in the distance. Police arrived too late. Too slow. Tear gas was deployed, but the violence had already spread. Local news captured fragments, mislabeling it clashes between rival student groups. No mention of the infiltration. No mention of the hate. Micah made it to safety an hour later, bruised but unbroken. The rally was declared inconclusive. The university issued a press statement, condemning the unexpected turn of events, while refusing to name the agitators. But the message had already spread. Micah wasn't just being debated anymore. He was being hunted. And then came the final straw. The next morning, the Broxley Institute's math department awoke to shattered glass and silence. Someone had thrown a brick through the front window. Security footage showed a lone figure in a hooded jacket, walking calmly, confidently, toward the building just after 3 a.m. Taped to the brick was a white sheet of paper. 3 words, printed in bold. Micah Trenton dies. The paper had been folded once. Clean. Deliberate. No fingerprints. No witnesses. But the threat was no longer theoretical. It was war. Someone throws a brick through the window of the math department, with Micah's name taped to it. The shattered glass was swept up by mid-morning. The taped threat, Micah's name inked beneath a death sentence, was sealed in a Ziploc bag and handed to campus security. They cataloged it with bureaucratic precision, like a misplaced library book. No sirens, no news alerts, no arrest. But for Micah, the silence around the act rang louder than the threat itself. This wasn't just about a brick. It was about the quiet approval that allowed it. The invisible nod from a world that watched black excellence with a target in hand. That night, as the campus emptied under rain clouds and yellow caution tape, Micah sat alone in the institute's research wing. He had barely slept. The same notebook sat in front of him, pages filled with numbers that once felt like prophecy but now read like warning signs. He wasn't scared anymore. He was tired. Tired of existing under a microscope. Tired of carrying genius like a burden. Tired of being told he didn't belong, even after proving he did. And then he made a decision. Not to run, not to hide, but to speak. At 2:17 a.m., under flickering fluorescent light and the hum of storm winds outside, Micah turned on his laptop camera. No crew, no script, just him. He sat in a hoodie, no logos, no filters. Behind him was a plain wall and a chalkboard, with part of his formula still visible in faded white lines. He looked directly into the lens and began. Micah didn't yell. He didn't name names. He didn't rant. Instead, he told the truth. He explained the math, his method, step by step so plainly that even non-mathematicians could follow. He walked through his upbringing in Southeast Houston, how he used to do algebra on the back of cereal boxes, because his family couldn't afford new notebooks, how his mother checked out library books, so he could teach himself calculus because there weren't advanced classes at his high school. He described what it meant to grow up brilliant, black, and invisible. The subtle suffocations, teachers who lowered their eyes when he raised his hand too often. Advisors who redirected him from STEM to communications. The college counselor who said, "Reach a little lower just in case." And then he said the words that struck a match in every soul watching. They didn't try to stop my math. They tried to stop me. He paused, let the silence hang, and ended with a message, not of bitterness, but of clarity. You don't get to erase us anymore. We belong in every room. He clicked upload. The video was 9 minutes long. By dawn, it had 4 million views. Educators began reposting it with personal reflections. Stories of gifted black students misdiagnosed with behavior disorders, placed in remedial tracks, or denied access to honors programs. Parents shared clips with captions like, "This is my son's story too." Students across the country began quoting Micah in their bios. We belong in every room. Within 48 hours, the video had become more than viral. It had become a movement. A nonprofit called Black STEM Futures launched a grant program in Micah's name. State legislators introduced bills to audit gifted and talented programs for racial bias. Universities held emergency roundtables on institutional discrimination. Even the Department of Education released a statement acknowledging systemic barriers faced by black students in advanced academic tracks. The hashtag "We Belong in Every Room" trended for a week. Broxley Institute, recognizing the cultural moment, granted Micah full autonomy over a new fellowship program, designed to identify and mentor overlooked mathematical talent in underserved communities. He didn't just become a name, he became infrastructure. A documentary team followed him through it all. They filmed him walking through his old neighborhood, visiting the library where he taught himself derivatives, and mentoring a sixth-grade girl who had just won a citywide math competition. Her first. The footage was raw, unpolished, and electric. Through it all, Micah remained grounded. He refused TV appearances that wanted soundbites instead of substance. He declined tech sponsorships that tried to brand his image into advertisements. He turned down a lucrative book deal that wanted to title his memoir The Accidental Genius, because none of it had been accidental. But while Micah rose, Delroy fell. Not quickly, not loudly, but inevitably. The professor hadn't been fired. Universities rarely did that. Instead, he was placed on administrative leave pending review. His classes were reassigned. His office was quietly emptied. His name removed from committee chairs and published newsletters. Faculty email groups began to exclude him. Still, he didn't apologize. Instead, Delroy started a podcast. He called it Truth in Academia. In it, he bemoaned the politicization of scholarship, the weaponization of student narratives, and the erosion of academic standards in favor of identity politics. He never used Micah's name, but the subtext was radioactive. He framed himself as a martyr for rigor, a casualty of the DEI regime. To his audience, small but loud, he was a victim, a man punished for holding the line. But to the wider world, he was a relic. Sponsors pulled out. His publisher dropped his upcoming textbook. Former colleagues distanced themselves. Guest lectures were quietly canceled. Still, he persisted. Then came the final twist. In a confidential board meeting at Houston Gateway University, the administration, now under immense public scrutiny, voted to offer Delroy a severance package. It was generous. Retirement-level payout, full pension, lifetime access to institutional resources, under the condition that he resign quietly and never return. It was a clean exit. No lawsuits, no headlines, no admission of fault. Delroy reviewed the offer and refused. The university quietly offers Delroy a severance package, and he refuses to leave. The refusal echoed louder than any press release. By rejecting the severance package, Professor Grant Delroy had not just chosen to stay, he declared war, a silent, calculated war to defend the institution that protected him for decades, and to weaponize the very structure that once elevated him. Tenure. Tenure wasn't just a job security mechanism. It was armor, and Delroy wore it like a shield, daring anyone to try and pierce it. But Micah wasn't aiming for Delroy. He was aiming for the system that built him. The tipping point came when an anonymous whistleblower, rumored to be a former staffer from Houston Gateway's Office of Student Affairs, sent Micah a flash drive. Inside were email chains dating back nearly 10 years. Dozens of them. Subject lines like, repeated complaints re Delroy, concerns from Black Student Org, Delroy patterns. Request, investigate calculus, racial grade disparity. Each message followed a rhythm. A student reports mistreatment, dismissive language, uneven grading, public humiliation. The administration responds with thanks, assures discretion, and promises internal review. Then nothing. One message from 2015 showed a Black student had submitted a formal complaint after being told by Delroy during office hours that people like you often struggle with structure. She received no reply. Another email, from a graduating senior in 2018, detailed being the only student penalized for using an alternate proof, ironically the same technique Micah would later reinvent. Most damning were the CC'd chains between faculty leadership, acknowledging a pattern in Delroy's interactions with minority students, but debating whether raising the issue might cause reputational risk. Micah stared at the screen, hands trembling, not with surprise, but with confirmation. The racism he experienced wasn't new. It was tradition. With Broxley's legal team and a network of Black alumni, Micah assembled a formal case, not just against Delroy, but against the infrastructure that silenced the students who came before him. He didn't call it revenge. He called it accountability. The coalition went public in a press conference outside Houston Gateway University. Standing beside Micah were former students, civil rights attorneys, professors of color from other institutions, and Pastor Elijah Das, still firm in his Sunday suit, holding the mic like it was a pulpit. They called for three things: a full independent investigation into all past complaints against Delroy, a legal review of the university's mishandling of student grievances involving race, a formal reconsideration of Delroy's tenure, publicly, with community oversight, The administration tried to stay quiet, but the noise wouldn't let them. Within days, students began a sit-in at the university's main hall. They brought laptops, sleeping bags, chargers, and printed quotes from the emails Micah had leaked, taped across every glass window. The university's name was covered in red paper signs that read, "Tenure Nays Immunity." Some faculty tried to dismiss it as a student stunt. Then the donors got involved. 3 major alumni benefactors sent letters to the Board of Trustees, threatening to withhold donations until the matter of racial misconduct and policy opacity was addressed. One tech CEO, who had quietly admired Micah's rise, withdrew a 7-figure endowment. The university cracked. They announced a formal tenure review process, something almost unheard of. Delroy would face a panel, public hearings would be scheduled, and this time, they promised transparency. Delroy responded with fury. He called it a witch hunt, a betrayal, a soft academic coup, orchestrated by identity politics. He gave an exclusive interview on his podcast, casting himself as a martyr for merit. He claimed he was being targeted because he demanded rigor, and because the current generation has been taught to conflate criticism with bigotry. He used words like cancel culture and anti-intellectualism, but cracks had already formed in his image. A student-run archive site released audio clips of Delroy's past lectures, sent in anonymously. In one, he jokes about the statistical miracle of black students outscoring their peers. In another, he sighs after calling on a Latina student and says, "Let's hope this doesn't turn into a TED Talk." The recordings spread like wildfire. His defenders went quiet. The board hearing was scheduled for mid-March. For the first time in the school's history, it was live-streamed. Delroy arrived in a charcoal suit, flanked by legal advisors. Micah, seated with his legal counsel, didn't speak. He didn't need to. His case had already been made in years of ignored complaints, leaked evidence, and broken silence. Over the course of 2 days, a dozen former students testified. Their stories echoed each other like verses in a tragic anthem. One young woman choked back tears as she recalled how Delroy publicly questioned whether she understood what an integral even was. A graduate student said his research proposal was dismissed by Delroy as unfocused, even though the same proposal later won a national fellowship. The most gut-wrenching moment came when a former student, now a public school math teacher, read an email Delroy had sent her after she dropped the class. "Some minds simply aren't built for abstraction. Best of luck in education." The board members sat in visible discomfort. Delroy's defense team tried to claim it was taken out of context, that Delroy was known for being equally tough on all students, that many of the complainants had poor academic records. But the evidence had a momentum of its own. The hearing was still underway when an unexpected email surfaced. From a former administrative assistant, an internal memo dated 2019, titled "Handling Sensitive Faculty Complaints." It explicitly named Delroy, detailing how the university had chosen not to pursue an investigation after assessing potential institutional exposure. They had buried the past, not out of ignorance but out of strategy. And that changed everything. The board adjourned. Shaken, Micah didn't celebrate. He sat in the hallway afterward, head in his hands, breathing slowly. He hadn't just opened a wound, he'd revealed a disease, and the cure wouldn't be fast. Then came the twist. 3 days after the final hearing, Micah's legal team received a notification. A former student, one who had remained silent throughout the process, had filed a federal lawsuit against Houston Gateway University. The charges: racial discrimination, emotional distress, and institutional negligence. The named parties: Professor Grant Delroy and Dean Melissa Corbin. A former student files a lawsuit against the school and names Delroy and the dean. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation, but not the kind born from tabloid spectacle. This was different. Every pew creaked under the weight of presence. Students, alumni, journalists, professors, activists. The air was thick with something more than curiosity. It was justice long delayed, circling its moment. Micah Trenton sat at the front, beside the lead counsel of the student coalition. His posture was straight, his suit plain, his expression unreadable. He'd been coached to stay calm, avoid showing emotion, but inside memories surged like static chalkboards, whispered slurs, empty inboxes after filing complaints, the erased equations, the brick. He wasn't just testifying, he was breaking open years of institutional silence. The plaintiff's bench held 7 former students, each with their own story, Different years, majors, but all connected by one thread. They had been dismissed, degraded, or driven out by the same figure, under the same roof, protected by the same walls. The defendant table looked colder. Grant Delroy, flanked by university attorneys, wore his defiance like cologne. His suit was perfect, his gaze blank. Next to him, Dean Melissa Corbin tapped a pen against her legal pad, eyes never meeting the plaintiff's. The trial opened with routine motions. But once testimony began, routine evaporated. Micah was the second to take the stand. The room stilled as he walked forward. He didn't stumble. He didn't glance at Delroy. He looked directly at the jury, a diverse panel of 12, and began. His voice didn't shake. He recounted the day of the board, the humiliation, the smirk, the dismissal. He described the anxiety that followed, the isolation, the emails from students who said they had quit math because of Delroy's cold scorn. He walked the jury through how he discovered the buried complaints, the leaked memos, the ignored warnings. The university's lawyer objected when Micah referenced the racial implications of his treatment. The judge overruled it. Micah continued. He explained what it felt like to be doubted on sight, to be the smartest person in the room, but spoken to like a guest in someone else's house. He talked about how Delroy's dismissal wasn't just about the math, it was about the refusal to believe that a black mind could arrive at innovation without permission. By the time he stepped down, 3 jurors were visibly shaken. What followed was a procession of pain. One by one, students from past years came forward. A pre-med dropout who'd once been in Delroy's calculus class described how he mocked her in front of peers for failing basic logic. A grad student recounted how Delroy published a paper using a concept she'd pitched during a class discussion, without credit. Another student described a private meeting where he asked Delroy for feedback, only to be told, "You should focus on passing, not publishing." Each story was met with murmurs, some with gasps. The defense tried to poke holes. They asked about grades, attendance, records, but every time they tried to shift the narrative, the plaintiffs returned to the root, the power imbalance, the patterns of prejudice, the institutional silence. Then came the documents, internal emails, memos, deleted complaints recovered from the university server backups. One memo from 2016 included a direct quote from Dean Corbin. "If we press this, we open the door to scrutiny we're not prepared for." Another revealed the university had quietly settled with a student 5 years prior, but buried it with an NDA. Dean Corbin's face drained of color as the paper trail unfolded in public. When it was her turn on the stand, she attempted grace under fire. She spoke of the university's mission, her respect for students, her regret that certain dynamics were overlooked, but the jury had already seen her signature on 3 documents, each approving the closure of investigations before they began. Her attempts to redirect blame collapsed under ink and timestamp. Delroy, when called, refused to testify. He remained in his chair, eyes narrowed, fingers tapping, a man who once lectured thousands now rendered mute by evidence. The final blow came not from testimony, but from the data. A forensic statistician, an independent expert brought by the plaintiffs, analyzed 10 years of Delroy's grading. His findings were devastating. Black students had a fail rate 3.7 times higher than their peers, even when adjusting for attendance and prior GPA. Students of color who used non-standard but mathematically valid methods were disproportionately penalized. It wasn't a feeling anymore. It was math. The closing arguments echoed across the nation. The Student Coalition's counsel ended with a single sentence that struck every corner of the courtroom. These students were punished, not for being wrong, but for being right in ways this institution refused to see. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. When they returned, the room froze. Their verdict, in favor of the plaintiffs. On all counts, the damages awarded were unprecedented. A multi-million-dollar settlement to be divided among the plaintiffs, and a mandate requiring the university to undergo a 5-year oversight review by an external racial equity board. The room didn't erupt. It exhaled. Micah sat motionless as the judgment was read, not triumphant, not relieved, just quiet. Because it was never about the money, it was about the confirmation that the pain had been real, and that it had always been systemic. Delroy stood, buttoned his suit, and walked out without a word. Dean Corbin remained seated long after the jury left, her pen still tapping, tapping, tapping. Outside, reporters waited. Microphones extended. Flashbulbs exploded. Micah didn't speak. He didn't need to. Justice had finally spoken for him. The following week, as the headlines faded into policy drafts and HR restructurings, Micah received an email from a university across the country. Not just any university. One that had watched the trial, studied the footage, read his method, and recognized not just a student, but a visionary. The subject line was simple. Micah, will you help us build something better? A university across the country asks Micah to design a new math curriculum. Micah arrived in Boston under gray skies and cold wind, but the weight on his shoulders felt lighter than it had in years. The campus that welcomed him wasn't just offering a position, it was offering a clean page. Crestwell University, one of the few elite institutions actively rebuilding its academic pipeline from the inside out, had invited him not just to teach, but to lead. He was 30 days out from the verdict. 30 days into being called a pioneer. 30 days into every conversation beginning with, "We've been following your story." But in private, Micah still stared into mirrors and saw the silence before the applause, the chalk dust, the disbelief, the glass on the floor. He took the offer not for prestige but for purpose. Crestwell gave him full autonomy to launch an experimental math program for underrepresented students. Not remedial, not supportive. Advanced, radical, designed for those whose brilliance had been ignored, filtered or buried beneath someone else's syllabus. He named it Project North Star. Within weeks, applications poured in from across the country. Black students, Latinx students, Native students, kids who had built encryption codes on library computers, who solved integrals in their heads, but failed multiple choice tests, who were told to be realistic when they dreamed aloud. Micah built a team, not just from academia, but from the communities often left behind by it. He hired instructors who had worked in prison education programs, who had built math curriculums from scratch for kids in underfunded public schools, who had been denied tenure but still held on to brilliance like it was sacred. Their classrooms looked nothing like traditional lecture halls. Chalkboards lined all four walls. Beanbags replaced stiff chairs. Music played during problem sets. Students collaborated instead of competing. The rules were rewritten, because the old ones had never been made for them. Micah mentored personally. He saw himself in a 13-year-old black girl from Detroit, who had built her own graphing calculator app. In a quiet student from rural Louisiana, who used number theory to map soil density. In a deaf student from Oakland who restructured probability questions through visual logic. Each of them, in their own way, was what the system never saw coming. And slowly something shifted in him. His method, what began as a defense mechanism in a hostile classroom, was now being taught in textbooks, published in journals, cited in grant proposals. One major publisher approached him to co-author a new calculus curriculum based on his structure. Still, the applause never settled fully in his chest. Micah spoke before Congress that winter. A hearing on STEM equity brought together experts from across the nation. But when he took the mic, the room leaned in. He didn't begin with data. He began with stories. Students who dropped out of gifted programs, teachers who saw potential but lacked support. The cost of being invisible until proven undeniable. He ended with a truth that lingered. The question isn't whether the talent exists. It's whether we'll stop burying it under disbelief. Lawmakers nodded. Committees took notes. Funding was promised. But Micah had seen enough to know policy didn't heal trauma. It only delayed its return. At night he still woke sometimes from dreams that ended with chalkboards, vanishing mid-equation. Sometimes, his breath would hitch in lectures, flashing back to Delroy's voice, and more than once, standing in front of his students, he'd feel the phantom weight of imposter syndrome, pulling at his collar. Victory had come, but healing had its own pace. Pastor Elijah Doss visited Boston once, surprising him in the back of a lecture. They walked the Charles River at dusk, talking about purpose weariness, and the difference between being a symbol and being a survivor. Before leaving, the old man said something Micah never forgot. Sometimes we don't escape the fire, we build something inside it, so others know it's survivable. That winter, Micah was named to the National Mathematics Advisory Council. He declined a television deal, but accepted a feature in a peer-reviewed journal titled Black Methods, White Boards. He began writing his own book, not a memoir, but a blueprint. And just as he started to feel the rhythm of stability, it arrived. A letter. Not an email, not a text. A real envelope. Thick, cream-colored paper, no return address. The handwriting was familiar. Inside, a single sheet. Micah unfolded it with care, fingers tensing. At the top, 2 words.
No apology.
His chest tightened. The rest of the letter followed. Typed, brief, cold. You were never what they said you were, Micah. You were something far more dangerous, unpredictable, unstructured. And that's what threatened me. I don't write this to seek forgiveness. I write this to confirm that yes, you were right, but I will never say it in public.
GD.
No name. Just the initials. The page didn't shake in Micah's hands, but something inside him did. Micah receives a letter from Professor Delroy. Micah stared at the letter long after he'd finished reading it. The paper didn't burn his hands. It didn't scream. It didn't threaten, but it felt radioactive. There was no apology, no remorse, just cold honesty, the kind that cut deeper than rage. You were always talented. I just didn't want to admit it. That single sentence, clinical, detached, echoed louder than any insult Delroy had ever spoken aloud. It confirmed what Micah had always suspected, but never wanted to believe, that the resistance he faced wasn't about logic or proof. It was about control. Delroy hadn't doubted his method. He had feared his freedom. Micah sat alone in his small Boston apartment, the letter lying open like a wound on his kitchen table. A cup of untouched tea had gone cold beside it. Outside, snow began to fall, soft, relentless, silent. He read the letter again. Not because he needed to, but because something in him wanted to feel the final blow, to understand the anatomy of this enemy. Delroy hadn't written for closure. He had written for power. The letter wasn't a confession. It was a final attempt to control the narrative. Micah folded the paper once, then again. He didn't cry. He didn't throw it across the room. He lit a match. The flame rose gently, orange and hungry. Micah held the letter over the sink, watching the corners curl, blacken, then collapse inward. The ink vanished first, then the paper, then the weight. When the last ember died, he turned on the faucet and let the ashes wash away. That night, Micah walked through campus bundled in his coat, head low against the cold. But inside, something cracked open, not a wound, but a release. The letter had freed him, not because it offered peace, but because it removed the last illusion. Delroy would never apologize. And he didn't have to. Micah no longer needed it. Validation wasn't the goal anymore. Vindication had never been enough. What Delroy thought, or feared, or admitted in secret, it no longer mattered. His mission had outgrown the man who tried to bury it. The next morning, Micah drafted a plan, not for another lecture, not for a paper, for something permanent. He called it the Trenton Foundation for Academic Justice. It wouldn't be just a nonprofit. It would be a movement, a platform, a shield for students like him. Black, brilliant, and too often abandoned by the systems meant to uplift them. The foundation would offer legal aid, mentorship, curriculum consulting, and perhaps most urgently scholarships. Micah had seen too many prodigies disappear into silence. Students who once burned bright, then dimmed under the weight of bureaucracy, bias, or burnout. He couldn't save them all, but he could light a path. Within weeks, the foundation had funding, small at first, but steady. Alumni from Houston Gateway sent private donations. Tech firms he'd turned down quietly contributed. Even a few anonymous checks arrived, some with short notes. For the next Micah, he assembled a board made of former students, educators, legal advocates, and one retired postal clerk who still reminded him to eat. His mother. The foundation's mission was blunt and urgent: to protect, prepare, and propel marginalized students in academic spaces where justice has historically been optional. Its first program was symbolic and strategic: a national scholarship, named not after Micah, but after his high school math teacher, Ms. Donna Hill, who once stayed late 3 nights a week to help him prep for SAT math sections. She barely had time to cover in class. Micah insisted on it. He didn't want a legacy built on his name alone. He wanted it built on the names that got erased. The selection committee reviewed hundreds of applications. One stood out: a 16-year-old girl from Jacksonville, Florida. Straight A student, competitive coder, fluent in Python and C++, expelled from her high school after challenging her AP math teacher's grading pattern, which disproportionately penalized non-white students who used alternate methods for solving complex problems. She had spoken up during a school board meeting, citing data. The next week, she was removed from the AP program entirely. Her name was Trinity Palmer. Micah read her essay 3 times. She didn't write about injustice in abstract terms. She described what it felt like to be told she was disruptive, when all she did was question. She wrote about how her principal told her to just focus on getting through the year. She ended her essay with a line that hit Micah in the chest. "If the classroom isn't made for me, I'll build a better one." Unanimously, the board selected her as the first recipient of the Donna Hill Equity in STEM Scholarship. Micah requested to call her personally. He dialed the number. A pause. Then a cautious hello. He introduced himself not as a founder or a viral name, but simply as someone who read her story and believed in her mind. She was quiet at first. Then tears. Micah listened. He didn't rush her. When she finally spoke clearly, she said, "They said I didn't follow instructions, that I was making the class political." Micah replied, "No, you were making it accurate." There was a pause. Then, laughter. Small. Shaky. Real. He invited her to visit Crestwell, to sit in on classes, to meet his team. She accepted, and before the call ended, she asked him something he didn't expect. "Do you ever stop being scared they'll take it away?" Micah looked out the window, snow melting on the sill. "No," he answered honestly. "But eventually you stop asking for permission to keep it." That night, Micah stood before a new class of North Star Fellows, students of every background, some fresh out of high school, some returning after dropping out of traditional colleges. All of them gifted, all of them once doubted. He started class not with a formula, but a question. "What's something you've been told you don't belong in?" One by one they answered. Calculus, robotics, data analytics, graduate school, math. He nodded after each one. Then he said, "By the end of this course, I want you to make sure that list never ends with you again." The room was quiet, focused, fire lit behind every eye. Then he picked up the chalk. The foundation's first scholarship goes to a teen expelled for challenging her teacher's racism. The lecture hall was named after someone who, 20 years ago, had been asked to leave one just like it. Micah Trenton stood in the front of the room, marker in hand, as sunlight filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows. The building was part of the Trenton Institute for Mathematical Justice, a facility nestled inside a once-abandoned campus block in Boston, now transformed into a hub of radical possibility. Its walls didn't just teach, they testified. On the entrance plaque, beneath brushed steel letters, were 5 words Micah had written himself. "We belong in every room." Today's session was different, not because of the subject matter. He was teaching advanced calculus, after all, but because of what surrounded it. Along the corridor leading to the lecture hall were framed portraits, Black mathematicians from across history. Not just the famous ones, but the overlooked, the unsung. There were photos of Micah's early students, former North Star Fellows who now led research labs, ran AI startups, or returned to their communities as teachers. Every wall whispered that brilliance wasn't a fluke. It had always been present, just never protected. Micah didn't speak of himself much. His method, once dismissed as creative nonsense, was now foundational in optimization theory. It was taught not only across the country, but translated into 7 languages. Graduate programs studied it. Tech firms applied it. Policy think tanks cited it in talks on education equity. His personal story, however, had taken on a life of its own. The trial, the letter, the foundation, it had all become required reading in education programs, not as inspiration, but as instruction, a case study in how systems resist what they didn't create, and how people survive them anyway. As he wrote a new equation on the board, Micah paused, looking out at the class. They were watching him with a kind of reverence he still hadn't gotten used to. But what mattered more than their eyes was their audacity. These students didn't flinch when things got hard. They didn't second-guess their answers before speaking. They weren't afraid of their own minds, because they had seen what happened when someone like them fought back, and won. Micah's own office upstairs was sparse. No awards, no honorary degrees, just shelves of books, photos of his mother, and one framed piece of paper he never explained to anyone. The charred edge of Delroy's letter, saved from the sink. Not for bitterness, for memory. He kept it because even victory needed its receipts. Outside of teaching, the Trenton Foundation had grown into a national network, its scholarship recipients now numbered in the hundreds. Trinity Palmer, the first one, had just been accepted into a PhD program at MIT. She still texted him problems at midnight with the caption, "Look what they tried to stop." The institute had hosted summits on curriculum reform, partnered with indigenous educators to decolonize math instruction, and led workshops for school boards under federal review for racial disparity. When schools ignored students now, they knew someone was watching. Micah moved down the aisle of the lecture hall as students scribbled. He wasn't thinking about the past. He was thinking about a future no one could take credit for, one that belonged to those who built it with scarred hands and whole hearts. A girl in the third row, no more than 16, braided hair, glasses sliding down her nose, raised her hand. Micah pointed at her gently. She stood, nervous, but only for a second. "I think," she said carefully, "there's a better way to solve this." Micah blinked. Not because he was shocked, but because he remembered. He remembered standing in that first lecture hall at Houston Gateway, raising his own hand, and being told in front of everyone that confidence didn't mean competence. He remembered the board, the chalk, the laugh, and now, here she was.
Not asking for permission.
Just offering brilliance. He smiled. "Show me," he said. A young girl raises her hand, just like he once did, and says, "I think there's a better way to solve this." They tried to bury his brilliance. They mocked his method. They made him walk out of that classroom with nothing but his dignity. But Micah turned that pain into purpose, not just for himself, but for every student who's ever been told they don't belong. If you've ever felt underestimated, unseen or unheard, this story was for you.
Type yes if you believe in justice.
Subscribe if this broke your heart.